Your idea of a wild party weekend does not compare to what Florence pulled off in the Renaissance. Forget your TikTok dances and VIP sections. We are talking about a city where the most powerful family in Europe, the Medici, decided that living life meant turning the entire city into a stage for absolute spectacle. Like, these weren't just parties. They were epic, scandalous, and sometimes totally bizarre productions where art, power, and pure human wildness clashed in the streets. You thought you knew history. Get ready to have everything you think you know about fun flipped on its head. Number 7. The Midnight Garden Party of Forgotten Secrets. It was the year 1488. Spring had arrived in Florence, but the Medici, specifically Lorenzo the Magnificent, seemed to be channeling something deeper, something less obvious than the usual loud street festivals. This carnival was different. It did not spill into the Piazza della Signoria with boisterous crowds and open revelry. Instead, it was an invitation-only affair, whispered about in hushed tones among the city's most elite scholars, artists, and, it was rumored, practitioners of arcane arts. The location was not the Grand Palazzo Medici, but a sprawling, secluded garden on the Oltrarno side of the Arno River, close to where the magnificent Palazzo Pitti would one day stand. This garden, known only to a few, was already a place of mystery, filled with ancient statues, hidden grottos, and labyrinthine paths. The invitations were not printed on parchment with official seals. They were delicate leaves, pressed and dried, with symbols etched into their surfaces in gold leaf. A single stylized owl, its eyes glowing with a faint phosphorescence, adorned each leaf. Receiving one meant you were part of a very specific, very exclusive circle. You were expected to arrive after midnight, under the cover of darkness, wearing a mask that completely obscured your identity. Not just any mask, either. These were intricately crafted pieces made by the finest Florentine artisans, depicting mythical creatures, celestial bodies, or strange, abstract patterns. The goal was total anonymity. When guests arrived, they were greeted not by servants in livery, but by figures draped in dark robes, their faces hidden by veils. They led guests through winding paths lit by hundreds of flickering oil lamps, each casting long, dancing shadows. The air was not filled with the usual sounds of trumpets and drums. Instead, a haunting, ethereal music drifted through the garden. It was played on lutes, flutes, and harps, but the melodies were strange, almost otherworldly, composed specifically for this event by musicians who were also philosophers steeped in Neoplatonic thought. The theme of the Midnight Garden Party was the secrets of the cosmos. Lorenzo, a deep admirer of ancient Greek philosophy and esoteric knowledge, wanted to create an experience that transcended mere entertainment. There were no grand allegorical floats here. Instead, guests encountered a series of tableaux vivants, living sculptures, enacted by the most beautiful and enigmatic members of Florence's artistic community. In one grotto, a figure representing Plato reclined, surrounded by swirling mist, reciting fragments of the Timaeus. In another, masked dancers moved in slow, deliberate patterns, their movements mirroring the orbits of planets, a celestial ballet unfolding before mesmerized eyes. The food served was not the usual lavish spread of roasted meats and rich sauces. It was light, almost symbolic. Small, perfectly ripe fruits, rare nuts, and pastries shaped like stars and crescent moons were offered on silver platters. The wine was a light white vernaccia, served in delicate crystal goblets that chimed softly with every movement. There were no formal speeches or toasts. Conversation was encouraged, but it was meant to be intellectual, philosophical, an exchange of ideas under the cloak of anonymity. Scholars would discuss alchemy, astrology, and the nature of beauty, their voices low and intense. The heart of the garden held a central clearing. Here, a large circular pool reflected the moon and stars. Around the pool, figures dressed as planetary deities stood still, each holding an object that symbolized their celestial body. Mars held a miniature sword, Venus a rose, Jupiter a scepter. As the night progressed, a scholar, thought to be Marsilio Ficino himself, would stand by the pool and deliver a quiet discourse on the harmony of the spheres, the interconnectedness of all things, and the divine spark within humanity. His voice, calm and measured, carried across the hushed crowd, creating an atmosphere of deep reverence and intellectual stimulation. One specific detail that captured the imagination of those who attended was the Grove of Whispers. It was a section of the garden where ancient cypress trees formed a dense, almost impenetrable canopy. Among the trees, hidden speakers, perhaps cunningly placed musicians or even small mechanical devices, would emit faint whispers. These whispers were said to be fragments of ancient prophecies, forgotten incantations, or riddles about the universe. Guests would wander through this grove, straining to hear the elusive sounds, trying to decipher their meaning, adding another layer of intrigue and mystery to the night. As dawn approached, a soft, almost imperceptible signal would be given. The music would fade, the lamps would dim, and the masked figures would slowly disperse, melting back into the shadows from which they came. There was no grand finale, no fireworks, no boisterous farewells. Guests left as quietly as they arrived, carrying with them only the memory of a night of profound beauty, intellectual stimulation, and a lingering sense of mystery. The Midnight Garden Party was not designed to impress with overt opulence, but to enchant with subtle magic and the allure of the unknown. It was a carnival that lived less in the public eye and more in the private minds of those fortunate enough to be invited, a testament to Lorenzo's sophisticated taste and his desire to explore the deeper currents of Renaissance thought. These secret gatherings, it was believed, were where the true power of Florence, its intellectual and artistic spirit, truly resided. Number 6. The Carnival of Beasts and Shadows. The year was 1515, a few years after the Medici had returned to Florence following their brief expulsion. The city was still finding its footing, and the carnival that year felt different. It was less about the elegant, Neoplatonic ideals of Lorenzo the Magnificent's time, and more about the raw, visceral energy of the Florentine streets. This was not a carnival for the sophisticated court. This was a carnival for the masses, a release of pent-up energy, a descent into playful chaos before the solemnity of Lent. It was known as the Carnival of Beasts and Shadows, and it was perhaps the most unsettling and exhilarating of the city's annual celebrations. The preparations for this carnival began not in the grand palaces, but in the artisans' workshops and the poorer neighborhoods. Mask makers worked tirelessly, creating masks that were grotesque, exaggerated, and often terrifying. There were masks of wolves with snarling teeth, bears with matted fur, wild boars with tusks, and strange hybrid creatures born from nightmare and folklore. The costumes were not silk and brocade, but rough animal hides, dark cloaks, and tattered rags, smeared with mud and soot. The intention was to shed human identity and embrace the primal, the animalistic. On the main day, as the sun began to set, a strange procession emerged from the Oltrarno, crossing the Ponte Vecchio. It was not a parade of floats with allegorical figures. It was a procession of beasts. Hundreds of people, clad in their animal masks and costumes, moved through the streets. They did not march in an orderly fashion. They slunk, they stalked, they lumbered, mimicking the movements of the animals they represented. Small groups would break off, hunting each other in playful chases through the narrow alleys. The air was filled with growls, snarls, hoots, and howls, creating a cacophony that was both frightening and exhilarating. The climax of this beast parade was the Piazza della Signoria. The square, usually reserved for formal events and public decrees, was transformed into a primordial forest. Large, makeshift trees made of branches and leaves were erected, creating dark groves and hiding places. Torches illuminated the scene with a flickering orange light, casting long, dancing shadows that made the beasts appear even more monstrous. The sound of drums, deep and resonant, pulsated through the square, a primal rhythm that urged the masked figures into a wild, untamed dance. The entertainment was not refined. There were no theatrical performances or elegant music. Instead, there were mock hunts, where groups of masked hunters would chase down other masked animals, culminating in playful captures and releases. Acrobatics were performed by agile figures in spider or monkey costumes, swinging from makeshift ropes strung between buildings. storytellers, their faces hidden by raven masks, would weave tales of ancient Florentine folklore, of witches in the Mugello Mountains and spirits lurking in the Arno. These stories were often dark, filled with mischief and sometimes a hint of true danger. The food was hearty and rustic, reflecting the animalistic theme. Great skewers of roasted wild boar and venison were passed around. Dark, unfiltered wine flowed freely from wooden barrels. People ate with their hands, tearing at meat, their masked faces creating a strange tableau. The formal distinctions of society seemed to melt away. Noblemen in their elaborate beast masks mingled with artisans and laborers, all united by the shared experience of shedding their human skin for a night. One particularly striking detail of the Carnival of Beasts was the shadow play. As the night deepened, large white cloths were strung across the openings of buildings facing the Piazza della Signoria. Behind these cloths, figures, sometimes human, sometimes large puppets, would perform shadow plays, illuminated by strong bonfires. These plays often depicted scenes of mythological battles between humans and beasts, or allegories of vice and virtue, but presented in a stark, often terrifying silhouette. The dancing shadows on the cloths created a pervasive sense of the uncanny, making the line between reality and illusion even blurrier. Children would gasp in delight and fear as gigantic, shadowy monsters battled tiny human figures. As the late hours approached, the revelry would become even more frenzied. The wild dances would intensify and the mock hunts would grow more elaborate. Some accounts suggest that the beasts would occasionally attempt to capture unmasked spectators, gently but firmly drawing them into the swirling chaos, encouraging them to shed their inhibitions. The night ended, not with a formal closing ceremony, but with a gradual exhaustion. As the sky began to lighten, the beasts would slowly disperse, their roars and howls fading into the sounds of the waking city. People would stumble home, covered in soot and sweat, their animalistic masks clutched in their hands, the memory of their wild abandon lingering in their minds. The Carnival of Beasts was a powerful reminder that even in the heart of the Renaissance, the wild, untamed spirit of humanity was always present, ready to emerge with the coming of the carnival season. It was a necessary release, a cleansing of the soul before the quiet austerity of Lent. Number 5, the Festival of Illusions and Moving Marvels. The year 1472, Florence was humming with intellectual curiosity and artistic innovation. This was the era of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who understood the power of spectacle and the allure of new technologies. This carnival was dedicated to the mind, to wonder, and to the breathtaking possibilities of art and engineering. It was known as the Festival of Illusions and Moving Marvels, a true marvel of Renaissance stagecraft and artistic ingenuity. This was the carnival where art not only represented reality, but actively transformed it. The preparation for this festival was a collaborative effort involving some of Florence's most brilliant minds. Architects, engineers, painters, and sculptors worked together, their workshops buzzing with secret projects. It was whispered that even young Leonardo da Vinci, still an apprentice in Verrocchio's studio, contributed to some of the mechanical wonders. The main focus was not just on costumes or floats, but on creating entire environments that would trick the eye and transport the spectator. The central stage for this festival was the Piazza di San Lorenzo, a choice that underscored the Medici family's patronage of the church and the arts. The square was transformed into a vast outdoor theater. Large, temporary structures were erected, draped with painted canvases depicting fantastical landscapes, towering castles, or swirling nebulae. These backdrops were not static. They were designed with clever mechanisms, allowing them to shift, rotate, or even collapse and reassemble, creating dynamic changes in scenery. The highlight of the Festival of Illusions was the Heavenly Ascent. This was a spectacular demonstration of engineering prowess. A massive, ornate cloud, seemingly suspended in mid-air, would slowly descend from above the square. On this cloud, figures dressed as angels and celestial beings moved with graceful precision. The mechanism was hidden, operated by an intricate system of ropes and counterweights, creating the illusion of genuine flight. As the cloud descended, it would open up, revealing more figures, perhaps a representation of the Virgin Mary or Christ, before slowly ascending again, disappearing into the painted heavens. The crowd would gasp, their faces upturned, utterly convinced by the magic unfolding before their eyes. Another central attraction was the perspective gallery. A long, narrow passageway was constructed, its walls painted, with astonishingly realistic murals that created a profound sense of depth. As people walked through, the perspective would shift and distort, making the passageway seem endless or suddenly shrinking to a tiny opening. This was an early exploration of anamorphosis and forced perspective, techniques that were revolutionizing painting at the time. At the end of the gallery, a large mirror was positioned, reflecting the distorted image of the viewer, making them part of the illusion themselves. The entertainment was deeply theatrical. Elaborate macheret were performed, not as simple dances but as complex narratives. Actors wearing masks of gods, goddesses, and mythological creatures would engage in highly choreographed scenes, sometimes even flying across the stage using more hidden mechanisms. The music was provided by full orchestras incorporating new instruments and complex polyphonic compositions, adding another layer of sensory richness to the illusion. The compositions were often grand and dramatic, designed to heighten the emotional impact of the unfolding spectacle. Food and drink were served by servants dressed as figures from ancient mythology. Nymphs offered sweet wines, and satyrs distributed roasted almonds and candied fruits. The dining experience was integrated into the overall illusion, with food presented in artful arrangements that mirrored the aesthetic themes of the festival. Dishes were sometimes served on trays that spun or shifted, adding a playful element of surprise. A particularly captivating detail of the Festival of Illusions was the Antern of Whispers. In a darkened section of the square, a large, intricately carved wooden lantern was suspended. Inside, small, delicate mechanisms and mirrors would project moving images onto the surrounding walls and even the ground. These images were not simple shadows, but complex patterns and even crude animated sequences of mythical creatures or swirling constellations. As the images moved, faint sounds would emanate from the lantern, whispers of ancient spells or the faint rustling of unseen wings. It was a precursor to magic lantern shows, creating a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic effect. The night would climax with a grand firework display, but even the fireworks were integrated into the illusion. The rockets would launch not just into the sky, but from various hidden points around the square, creating patterns that seemed to form celestial bodies or mythical beasts in the darkened sky. The explosions were synchronized with the music, creating a symphony of light and sound. As the last sparks faded, the temporary structures would remain, but the magical atmosphere would slowly dissipate. People left the square feeling as though they had truly visited another realm, their minds buzzing with the wonders they had witnessed. The Festival of Illusions and Moving Marvels was a testament to Florence's status as the birthplace of the Renaissance, a place where art, science, and imagination converged to create something truly magical. It showed that the Medici were not just patrons of static beauty, but also pioneers of dynamic, transformative art. Number 4, the Tournament of the Golden Lion. The year was 1490. Lorenzo the Magnificent, at the height of his power and influence, decided to host a carnival that harkened back to the age of chivalry, but with a distinct Florentine flair. This was not just a parade, it was a grand display of martial prowess, artistic pageantry, and political power. It was known as the Tournament of the Golden Lion, a spectacle that combined the thrill of a medieval joust with the refined aesthetics of the Renaissance. This event was a deliberate display of Florence's wealth and military strength, cloaked in the guise of chivalrous sport. The setting for this magnificent tournament was the Piazza Santa Croce. The square, usually a place of religious solemnity, was transformed into a jousting arena. Grandstands adorned with tapestries depicting heroic deeds and classical myths were erected around the perimeter. The Medici family box, strategically placed for optimal viewing, was a masterpiece of temporary architecture, draped in crimson velvet and gold embroidery, emblazoned with their coat of arms. The center of the square was covered in sand, meticulously leveled for the joust. The main event began with a grand procession of knights and their retinues. These were not just professional soldiers. Many were young noblemen from Florence and allied cities, eager to display their courage and skill. Each knight was dressed in magnificent custom-made armor, often engraved and gilded. Their horses were equally splendid, adorned with colorful caparisons and plumes. The theme for the tournament was the defense of Florence, and each knight adopted an allegorical persona representing a virtue or a protector of the city. One knight might be valor, another justice, and another prosperity. The most anticipated arrival was Lorenzo de' Medici himself. He did not participate in the joust, but he presided over the event with regal authority. His entrance was marked by a fanfare of trumpets and drums as he arrived in a specially constructed carriage shaped like a golden lion pulled by 6 white horses. The lion was not just an emblem of Florence, it was a symbol of strength and power, embodying the Medici's dominant position. Lorenzo was dressed in a gown of dark velvet, embroidered with pearls and diamonds, a crown of laurel leaves resting upon his brow, a nod to his poetic and scholarly pursuits. The tournament itself consisted of various martial games. The most popular was the joust, where 2 knights, riding at full gallop, attempted to unseat each other with blunted lances. The crowd roared with every splintered lance and every fall. There were also sword fights, performed with blunted weapons and choreographed for maximum dramatic effect, demonstrating agility and skill rather than brute force. Archery contests tested the precision of the city's finest bowmen. The knights were judged not only on their skill but also on their deportment, their adherence to chivalric codes, and the artistry of their costumes. Between the martial displays, there were interludes of entertainment that showcased Florence's artistic prowess. Musicians played heroic fanfares and ballads on lutes and trumpets. Acrobats performed daring feats on ropes stretched high above the square. Perhaps the most charming were the children's cavalcade, where young boys, dressed in miniature armor and riding ponies, would stage their own mock joust, a delightful and humorous spectacle that enchanted the crowd. The food and drinks served were befitting a grand public festival. Vats of wine were distributed to the crowds. The bakers worked tirelessly, producing vast quantities of bread and sweet pastries. Roasted meats were sold from temporary stalls set up around the square. For the elite in the grandstands, there were more refined delicacies, including spiced wines, game pies, and elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like fortresses and knights. A specific detail that stood out during the Tournament of the Golden Lion was the living heraldry. As each knight entered the arena, accompanied by his squire and banner, a group of performers would emerge, dressed in costumes that represented the knight's personal crest or heraldic device. If a knight's crest was a griffin, performers would emerge in magnificent griffin costumes, dancing and moving in intricate patterns, adding a dynamic, artistic flourish to the traditional heraldic display. This made the presentation of each competitor a miniature performance in itself, blurring the lines between sport and art. The climax of the tournament was the awarding of the prize. The victor of the joust, the knight who had performed with the most skill and grace, was presented with a magnificent golden lion statuette, often crafted by a renowned Florentine sculptor like Andrea del Verrocchio or a member of his workshop. The presentation was made by Lorenzo de' Medici himself, a gesture that further cemented his role as the patron of both arms and arts. The night concluded with a grand celebratory feast held in a nearby palazzo for the noble participants, filled with music, dancing, and eloquent speeches praising the virtues of chivalry and the glory of Florence. The Tournament of the Golden Lion was a powerful declaration of Florentine pride and Medici dominance, a spectacle that combined the raw excitement of competition with the refined beauty of Renaissance art. It showcased a city at its peak, capable of hosting events that were both historically resonant and artistically groundbreaking. Number 3, the Masquerade of the Elements. It was the winter of 1533. Catherine de' Medici, the young Florentine noblewoman, was about to leave Florence to marry Henri, the second son of King Francis I of France. Before her departure, her family, still reeling from past political turmoil but now firmly back in power, decided to host a farewell carnival that would showcase Florentine artistry and opulence to her future French court. This carnival was a grand, theatrical affair deeply influenced by Catherine's sophisticated taste and the burgeoning French court aesthetic. It was known as the Masquerade of the Elements. The theme of the carnival revolved around the four classical elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Each element was given its own specific day of celebration, culminating in a grand union on the final night. The entire city became a stage for this intricate performance, with specific districts and squares dedicated to different elemental representations. This allowed for an immersive experience, drawing all of Florence into the spectacle. The first day was dedicated to earth. The streets around the Palazzo Pitti, where Catherine was residing, were adorned with lush greenery, real trees brought in and planted for the occasion, and garlands of flowers. Contemporary grottos were constructed, resembling ancient caves where figures dressed as nymphs, satyrs, and woodland creatures danced to rustic, earthy music played on pipes and drums. Processions featured floats adorned with rich soil, blossoming plants, and even live animals like goats and deer, representing the bounty of the earth. The costumes were made of heavy velvets, deep greens, and browns, often adorned with leaves, moss, and polished stones. The second day celebrated air. The focus shifted to the open spaces of the Piazza della Santissima Annunziata. This square was transformed into a celestial dome. Blue and white fabrics were stretched high above, creating the illusion of a vast sky with painted clouds and stars. Elaborate kites, shaped like birds and winged creatures, were flown, some of them massive, carrying small costumed figures in their baskets, creating the astonishing illusion of humans soaring through the air. Acrobats dressed as angels and zephyrs performed daring feats on ropes suspended between buildings. The costumes were light, flowing silks in blues and whites, adorned with feathers and diaphanous veils. The third day was for fire. As night fell, the festivities moved to the banks of the Arno River. Hundreds of braziers and flaming torches lined the riverbanks, casting a fiery glow on the water. Fire dancers, their bodies gleaming with oil, performed breathtaking routines, manipulating flames with incredible skill. Fireworks, more complex and elaborate than ever before, exploded over the river, creating dazzling patterns of light and sound. A massive temporary sculpture of a phoenix, made of wood and straw, was set alight on a float, slowly burning away to reveal a new shimmering bird emerging from its ashes, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. The costumes were in fiery reds, oranges, and golds, shimmering with metallic threads and adorned with sequins that caught the light. The fourth day was dedicated to water. The climax of the celebration took place on the Arno itself. A flotilla of specially constructed barges, shaped like sea creatures and mythological vessels, sailed down the river. On board these floating theaters, performers dressed as mermaids, tritons, and sea gods enacted scenes from ancient myths, accompanied by music played on instruments that mimicked the sound of the ocean. Water jets were incorporated into the barges, spraying elegant fountains high into the air. The costumes were in various shades of blue and green, made of shimmering fabrics that mimicked scales adorned with pearls and shells. The grand finale, on the final night, brought all the elements together in the Piazza della Signoria. The square was decorated to represent a cosmic convergence. Floats representing each element processed simultaneously, converging in the center of the square. A massive elemental altar was constructed, at which actors representing the four classical philosophers, Thales for water, Anaximenes for air, Heraclitus for fire, and Empedocles for earth, offered poetic invocations to the harmony of the cosmos. Dancers representing all four elements performed a unified ballet, their movements weaving together the distinct characteristics of each element. The food and drink for each day followed the elemental theme. On Earth Day, there were root vegetables, game from the Tuscan hills, and robust red wines. On Air Day, light pastries, delicate fowl, and sparkling white wines were served. Fire Day featured spiced and grilled meats and strong dark spirits. Water Day offered fresh fish, seafood, and crisp, clear spring water. The meals were as much a part of the immersive experience as the visual spectacles. A particularly captivating detail of the Masquerade of the Elements was the elemental gardens that were constructed in secret courtyards throughout the city. These were miniature temporary gardens, each meticulously designed to represent a specific element. The Earth Garden was a dense thicket of fragrant herbs and ancient stones. The Air Garden featured wind chimes and delicate, translucent fabrics that billowed in the breeze. The Fire Garden had miniature bonfires and intricate arrangements of glowing embers. The Water Garden contained small fountains and reflective pools. Visitors could discover these hidden oases, stepping from the grand public spectacle into intimate sensory experiences. The masquerade culminated in a grand ball at the Palazzo Vecchio, where Catherine de' Medici made her final public appearance before her departure. Guests arrived in costumes that combined elements from all four themes, creating a stunning tapestry of color and texture. The night was filled with dancing, music, and feasting, a joyous farewell to the young bride. The Masquerade of the Elements was a testament to Florence's enduring artistic ingenuity and its ability to create immersive, multi-sensory experiences. It was a carnival that not only celebrated the city's rich culture, but also served as a magnificent send-off for a princess who would carry the Florentine spirit to the French court. Number 2, the Festival of the Golden Age and the Return of the Gods. The year was 1475. Florence was experiencing a period of immense artistic and intellectual flourishing, often referred to as a golden age. Lorenzo the Magnificent, seeking to solidify this image and project an aura of classical grandeur, orchestrated a carnival of unprecedented scale and classical inspiration. This was the Festival of the Golden Age and the Return of the Gods, a living tableau of classical mythology designed to celebrate Florence as the new Athens. The central concept of this carnival was the literal appearance of the Olympian gods and goddesses in the streets of Florence. The entire city became Mount Olympus, a stage for divine revelry. The preparations were meticulous and involved not only the finest artists and artisans, but also scholars steeped in classical literature and mythology. Every detail, from the costumes to the floats, was designed to be historically accurate according to ancient texts, interpreted through the lens of Renaissance humanism. The grand procession began at dawn, stretching from the Boboli Gardens, then just being conceived, all the way to the Piazza del Duomo. Leading the procession was a magnificent float depicting Zeus, king of the gods, seated on a throne made of clouds, pulled by eagles whose wings moved mechanically. He was accompanied by Hera, his queen, in a chariot drawn by peacocks. Behind them followed the entire Olympian pantheon Apollo with his lyre, Venus on a seashell pulled by doves, Mars in his war chariot, Diana with her hunting dogs, Minerva with her owl, Mercury with winged sandals, and many more. The costumes for the divine figures were breathtaking. Artists like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio were rumored to have overseen the design of these elaborate garments, ensuring they reflected the classical ideals of beauty and proportion. Fabrics were imported silks adorned with gold and silver embroidery, pearls, and precious stones. Each deity carried their appropriate attributes: Poseidon, a trident; Ceres, a sheaf of wheat; Bacchus, a vine-crowned staff. The performers were carefully selected from Florence's most beautiful and charismatic citizens, often young noblemen and women embodying the perfect Renaissance ideal. As the procession moved through the city, it stopped at various designated sacred sites in the main squares. In the Piazza della Signoria, a temporary temple was erected resembling an ancient Greek edifice. Here, actors playing priests and priestesses would perform mock sacrifices, offering incense and libations to the returned gods. In the Piazza della Repubblica transformed into the Roman Forum, a dramatic debate between figures representing Plato and Aristotle was staged, showcasing Florence's intellectual prowess. The entertainment throughout the day and night was deeply rooted in classical forms. Choirs sang ancient Greek hymns reconstructed from fragments found in newly discovered manuscripts. Dancers performed ballets inspired by mythological narratives, their movements fluid and graceful, reminiscent of figures on classical vases. Poets recited epic verses, celebrating the triumphs of gods and heroes, often drawing parallels between the mythical past and the glorious present of Florence under Medici rule. There are also displays of athletic prowess, with young men competing in wrestling and discus throwing echoing the ancient Olympic Games. The food and drink were also given a classical touch. While Florence did not abandon its traditional carnival fare, there were specific Olympian banquets held in the gardens of the Medici palaces. Here, food was presented in a manner that invoked the lavish feasts of ancient Rome. Dishes were arranged in elaborate tableaux depicting scenes from mythology. Wine, often spiced and sweetened, was served in amphora-shaped pitchers. There was an abundance of fresh fruits, nuts, and exotic delicacies, reflecting the vast reach of Florentine trade. A particularly memorable detail of the Festival of the Golden Age was the echoing grove created near the Duomo. Large, ornate panels painted with scenes of sylvan landscapes and mythological creatures were strategically placed to create an acoustic chamber. Hidden musicians playing flutes and lyres would perform, their music amplified and distorted by the panels, creating an ethereal, echoing sound that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Intermittently, a single clear voice would call out a line of ancient Greek poetry, and another voice, hidden, would respond, creating a dialogue that added to the magical, otherworldly atmosphere. As night fell, the grand finale took place at the Duomo. The entire facade of the cathedral was illuminated by hundreds of oil lamps and torches, making it appear as though the classical gods were truly descending from the heavens. A massive celestial sphere, an intricate mechanical device showing the orbits of the planets and stars, was slowly lowered from the dome, rotating majestically. Actors representing the Muses, led by Apollo, performed a final, solemn dance on a specially constructed platform, inviting the audience to reflect on the beauty, wisdom, and harmony of the universe. The night concluded with a grand banquet for the elite, followed by a torchlit procession through the streets, carrying the message of Florence's golden age to every corner of the city. The Festival of the Golden Age and the Return of the Gods was more than just a carnival. It was a powerful statement of cultural identity, a declaration that Florence, under the Medici, was the true heir to the classical world, a city where the gods themselves would feel at home. Number 1. The Triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne. The year was 1490. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, was at the zenith of his power and influence in Florence. Known for his keen intellect, his patronage of the arts, and his love for lavish spectacles, he orchestrated a carnival that would become one of the most famous and enduring examples of Renaissance public festivity. This was the Triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne, a joyous and uninhibited celebration of life, love, and the fleeting nature of pleasure. This event was a poetic and philosophical statement, a vibrant embodiment of the Carpe Diem ethos that resonated deeply with the Florentine spirit. The preparations for this triumph were immense, involving the city's finest artists, poets, musicians, and artisans. Lorenzo himself played a direct role in its conception, commissioning his court poet, Angelo Poliziano, to write the famous carnival song, Quante bella giovinezza, How Beautiful is Youth, which would become the anthem of the celebration. The entire city of Florence was transformed into a stage for this epic spectacle, but the heart of the procession was the main thoroughfare leading to the Piazza della Signoria. The main event was a series of allegorical floats known as carry, each more elaborate and symbolic than the last. The most iconic was, of course, the float of Bacchus and Ariadne. Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, was depicted as a handsome, youthful figure crowned with ivy and grapevines. He rode in a chariot garlanded with flowers and leaves, pulled by mythical creatures like panthers and tigers. Beside him sat Ariadne, the Cretan princess abandoned by Theseus, now joyously embraced by Bacchus, symbolizing love and renewal. The float was surrounded by a merry band of satyrs, fauns, and nymphs, dancing and playing musical instruments. Following the main float were numerous others, each representing different aspects of the Bacchanalian theme. There was a float dedicated to the pleasures of the hunt, with figures dressed as hunters and forest animals. Another depicted the joys of wine, overflowing with giant grape clusters and performers miming the process of winemaking. A float dedicated to youth and beauty featured beautiful young Florentine men and women, singing and throwing flowers to the crowds. Each float was accompanied by musicians playing lutes, flutes, tambourines, and drums, filling the air with vibrant, intoxicating music. The costumes for the participants were lavish and imaginative. Performers, dressed as satyrs, wore goat skins and horns, their faces painted with mirthful expressions. The nymphs wore flowing, diaphanous gowns in greens and blues, adorned with flowers and ribbons. Bacchus's retinue wore rich silks and brocades, reflecting the opulence of the god's domain. The color palette was vibrant and earthy, dominated by greens, browns, deep reds, and purples, mirroring the colors of nature and wine. As the floats processed through the city, they were met by throngs of eager Florentines. The streets were packed with people of all social classes, from noblemen to artisans, all caught up in the celebratory spirit. The spectators leaned from windows, stood on rooftops, and packed the narrow alleys, eager to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. The performers on the floats tossed sweets, nuts, and small coins to the crowds, sparking playful scrambles and cheers. The atmosphere was one of unbridled joy and collective abandon. The entertainment was primarily musical and performative. The famous Carnival song, Quanta bella giovinezza, was sung repeatedly by the performers on the floats and quickly picked up by the crowds, becoming an infectious, citywide chant. The lyrics spoke of the beauty of youth and the importance of seizing the moment, for tomorrow might bring sorrow. This sentiment resonated deeply with the spirit of Carnival, a time of freedom before the strictures of Lent. Our dancers on the floats performed lively, improvised movements, encouraging the crowd to join in. Impromptu dances often broke out in the streets, with masked revelers twirling and swaying to the rhythmic music. The food and drink were abundant and freely available. Wine flowed from communal barrels set up in the squares, often served from large, ornate pitchers. Bakers worked through the night, producing vast quantities of shaketada, a sweet yeasted flatbread flavored with orange and anise, a traditional carnival treat. Roasted chestnuts, sugared almonds, and various fried pastries, dusted with powdered sugar, were sold by vendors on every corner, their sweet aromas mingling with the scent of wine and wood smoke. A particularly charming detail of the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne was the fountain of wine. In the Piazza della Signoria, a temporary structure resembling a classical fountain was erected. However, instead of water, the fountain flowed with wine, allowing the public to freely partake. This literal outpouring of abundance perfectly captured the spirit of Bacchus and the generosity of the carnival season. It was a symbol of shared pleasure and prosperity, an open invitation to revelry for everyone. The crowd would gather around, filling their cups and laughing as the wine flowed freely. As the procession reached its climax in the Piazza della Signoria, the floats would circle the square, allowing everyone to fully appreciate their intricate artistry. The performers would engage in a final grand dance, with Bacchus and Ariadne taking center stage. As dusk approached, the festivities would transition into a citywide party. Bonfires would be lit in the squares, and the music would continue late into the night. People would feast, drink, sing, and dance, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their identities hidden behind masks, a shared moment of joyous abandon before the coming of Lent. The triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne was not just a parade, it was a profound expression of Florentine culture, a testament to Lorenzo's genius, and a celebration of human existence in all its glorious, fleeting beauty.